So a friend recently shared a short story with me that she had written. And when I read it, I realized that there were striking parallels to the story of Isaac, his trauma in last week's Parsha, his striking disappearance from the text, and the beginning of healing in this week's Parsha, Chayei Sarah. Now, before I get into this, I just want to say that I'm going to detail his trauma pretty specifically, so this is a trigger warning if anyone doesn't want to be here to listen to that. My friend's story is about a woman named Maya. She's a married mother of two working as a nurse in her husband's pediatric practice. It all looks really good from the outside. But then Maya, in her mid-50s, starts to look back at her childhood, a childhood in which she was severely abused. She begins to recognize the extent of what happened to her, and in the story, she begins to heal. One of the interesting things about the story is that for Maya, what was even worse than the abuse was her inability to tell her story. Every time she tried to name what was happening to her as a child, she was immediately shamed and blamed and made to feel crazy, that nothing was happening to her and that she was a horrible person. In her family, telling the truth was a crime far worse than the ways people destroyed one another. Here are a few lines from her story. She was not allowed to see what she saw or hear what she heard. She could not even know what she knew. For a long period of her childhood, she stopped speaking at all, because when she did speak, it inevitably led to an intensification of the abuse. Knowing that the truth would either mean that she would be killed or that somehow she was killing her father, she suppressed her truth in order to survive. And in so doing, she became unreal to her very self. She drove any sense of self underground. Another quote from the story. Without the sustenance of truth, her soul withered and died. And by the time she became old enough to leave home, she had died 1,000 silent deaths. No language, no utterance was permitted by which her soul could connect to another, could breathe fresh air. This takes us to the story of the Torah portions we are in, to Isaac's story. In last week's Parsha, Vayera, we read one of the most terrifying episodes in all of biblical literature, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. God commands Abraham to offer his beloved son Isaac as a sacrifice. And so Abraham goes on a 3-day journey with his unsuspecting beloved child. When Isaac questions the inscrutable reality before him, the truth is withheld. He's walking together with his father, carrying the very wood upon which he would be stretched out for sacrifice, and innocently asks, Avi, Daddy, Hineni b'ni. Abraham says, here I am, my son, seemingly saying, I am completely here for you, my son. Isaac asks, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Vayomer, Hine ha'esh v'haitzim, v'ayeh haseh le'olah. Where is that lamb? They are going on a journey to make an offering, but there is no sign of an animal to be sacrificed. Abraham obfuscates. He says, Vayomer Avraham, Elohim yir'eh haseh le'olah b'ni. And Abraham said, God will personally show us the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Is this a statement of faith? Or is Abraham straight out lying because he doesn't want to tell his son the truth? How could he tell him such a terrible truth? Whatever it is, the terrible truth is withheld from Isaac. He trustingly walks together with him, with his father, to the sacred site where he would seemingly be slaughtered. One can only imagine the shock, the disbelief, the horror Isaac feels when his father binds him for the sacrifice, when Abraham builds an altar with the wood Isaac carried. One can imagine Isaac's inside screaming, "Daddy, where is the lamb?" Abraham lifts up his son and puts him on the altar. "Daddy, where's the lamb?" Avi, ayeh haseh. Abraham binds him to the altar with a rope. "Daddy, it can't be me. I can't be the lamb. My father would not do this to me. My God could not do this to me. Avi, Avi." Abraham picks up the knife to slaughter his son. Isaac looks at the son and stops seeing. The Midrash says he goes blind, stops being able to comprehend the world. Because this, his beloved father trying to kill him, that can't be real. There are midrashim, rabbinic legends, that tell us that in that moment, Isaac actually did die. In Midrash Hagadol, Rabbi Yehuda says, since the knife came upon Isaac's neck, Isaac's soul burst out and departed. Parcha, v'yatzah nafsho shel Yitzchak. And no wonder, the fact that your father is trying to kill you is a truth that is too much to live with, a murderous truth, a truth that cannot be understood, cannot be spoken aloud. What would it take to recover from this trauma? For both Maya and Isaac, the truth died 1,000 deaths, and what was left was soul murder. And indeed, as Maya disappeared from her life, Isaac entirely disappears from the text. From chapter 22 until the end of chapter 24, which is the longest chapter in all of Genesis, and one of the longest chapters in the whole Torah. Isaac is nowhere to be seen. When Abraham returns from the Akedah and goes back with his lads, it doesn't say that he returns with Isaac. It's just Abraham and the lads. And then Isaac's mother dies, and Isaac is nowhere to be seen. He doesn't come to grieve her. And then Abraham decides that Isaac needs a wife and sends his servant. And for chapters and chapters, we hear about this courtship, this negotiation. Isaac is nowhere to be seen. This is the only courtship, as far as I can think of, without the actual bridegroom in the Torah. But what I really wanted to tell you in this for our Torah is not only about the effects of trauma, but about healing, about Isaac's healing, and a little bit about Maya's healing too. Isaac finally reemerges at the end of chapter 24. And I think it's instructive. The context in which he emerges, I think, tells us a great deal about healing. He's coming from the fields. And it says that he went to lasuach basadeh, to meditate or maybe pray in the fields. And in fact, in Psalm 104, the same word is used in a prayerful context. He also appears when his bride-to-be, Rebecca, comes on the scene. Maybe when he saw her, he felt a bit of strength or hope in her strength. And I think most instructive, he comes from a place called Be'er Lachai Ro'i, from the place of the well of the living one who sees me. That place is the place that Hagar named. That place is the place that Hagar went to when she was being abused by Sarah, who's then Sarai, right? And escaped Sarai and went into the wilderness and was promised a child, Yishmael, and promised also seed that she wouldn't be able to count, right? It was a promise that was very similar to Abraham's. And she would have a child who was named for her being heard, her suffering, her own need being heard. And then she names the place for being seen. So no wonder that Isaac wants to go to the place where one is seen and heard after a trauma. It makes so much sense that he comes from this healing place, a place that is only mentioned one more time as the place that Isaac settles in after Abraham's death. So it is clearly a significant place for Yitzchak. If we think for a moment about Isaac going out to the fields and praying and meditating, maybe that's where his insides, his inwardness started to develop. Because Maya, too, in that story, started going on hikes in the mountains that surrounded her home. And she started to pour out her heart, right? And she didn't exactly believe in God, but she found a way to tell her story. It was almost like it was a precursor to Reb Nachman of Bratslaw's, concept of prayer of hitbodedut, of praying your heart out, pouring your heart out to God when you're alone. Maya lives for many years not even thinking about the fact that she was abused. But then some yearning in her began to grow. She yearned for more of a sense of reality, more of a sense of life. And she didn't really know how to get it, but that yearning brought her to places, brought her to the mountains, brought her to her voice, brought her to telling her story to her friends and family. It strikes me that the stories of trauma are so much more dramatic than the story of healing or stories of healing. But healing, I think, is like that. Slow, uneventful, like a tree's slow growth underneath the ground, and it's reaching towards the heavens. Root by root and leaf by leaf, reaching at once higher and deeper every day, until its strength and power is undeniable, until the shade that it can offer to others is significant, nurturing, makes a difference. These are not happily ever after stories, not in the least. In fact, amazingly enough, they have nothing to do with happiness. They are stories of the possibility of healing, of re-entering the story after traumatic death. Stories about what is most important, being real, authentic, mattering, connecting, loving, telling one's story, bearing witness. May we all be blessed with being real, with knowing that we and life itself is really undeniably real, that we matter, with the ability to tell the truth, have the courage to bear witness to our own lives and to the beautiful and painful realities that we are living with in these times. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.